The day begins with a mountain that is more than a mountain. In northern Sumatra, a caldera that does not yet exist prepares to take shape as pressure builds in a body of silica-rich magma that has been accumulating for tens of thousands of years. When the system fails, it fails completely. The eruption that follows is a super-eruption on the order of a volcanic explosivity index 8 among the largest events known in the Quaternary, ejecting thousands of cubic kilometers of material and pushing an umbrella cloud into the stratosphere. Ash columns climb beyond the weather, where winds spread ash and sulfur aerosols across the tropics and into the subtropics. Pyroclastic flows scour the highlands around the vent and pumice rafts drift out onto the Indian Ocean. In the minutes and hours that pass, the geography of northern Sumatra is rewritten, and in the years that follow, the atmosphere itself carries the imprint of the event. The plume dims, sunlight cools surface temperatures and weakens seasonal rains. Over South Asia, ash settles in layers that will later be recognized as glassy fragments in soils and river terraces. In peninsular India, a blanket of tuff preserves a record that lies above and below continuous stone tool traditions. Across Africa, microscopic shards of the same eruption will be found in lake sediments far from Sumatra, a chemical signature linking distant basins to the same violent source. The story that concerns humans begins not with catastrophe as spectacle, but with environments shifted just enough and for long enough to make a difficult life more difficult. They live in small bands and they move as they always do, following water plants and animals across savanna woodland and coast. In the wake of the eruption, the sun's reduced energy cools seas and land, and monsoon systems change amplitude and timing. Some regions experience years with shorter growing seasons, others face droughts, and still others, paradoxically, see more moisture as storm tracks adjust. The scale is planetary sulfuric acid aerosols in the stratosphere scatter incoming light, and as heat budgets change, circulation patterns reconfigure. Glaciers at high latitudes grow, sea surfaces cool, productivity in marine upwelling zones shifts. Against that background, a small primate species that already survives on marginal calories must rework its options. On some coasts, people intensify shoreline foraging, turning to shellfish, crabs, and stranded fish as dependable foods when interior resources fail. The least risky calories come from tide pools, and estuaries and shell rings begin to grow in places where stone and bone already tell a story of coastal skill. Inland groups retreat toward perennial springs, river confluences, and lake margins, reusing camps that have fresh water and predictable shade. Middle Paleolithic toolkits continue with little interruption in several regions, a detail that matters because it shows cultural continuity when an interruption might be expected. At sites in India, artifacts above and below ash layers share the same technological fingerprints. The lesser-known traces are a smaller scatter of debitage sealed by a few centimetres of tephra, a hearth stained with ochre under a thin grey horizon, a shell bead drilled and carried inland along a river corridor where ash never fell thick. At night, the sky is not simply dark, it is dusted, and the horizon glows in unfamiliar ways as fine aerosols turn the sunsets long. They do not name it. They wait for wind. They follow animals, they test plants, and they remember which valleys still hold water late in the dry season. The timing of the eruption about 74,000 years ago places it near shifts in marine isotope stages when ice volume and sea level are already in motion. Lowered seas expose continental shelves and stretch coastlines outward by tens to hundreds of kilometers. Shorelines that once lay beneath waves now hold lagoons, dunes, and salt flats, opening travel corridors comparable in length to journeys from Cairo to Delhi. On those new lands, trees colonize, then die back as climates swing. People see further from low bluffs, and fires at night remain their technology for cooking and for warmth. Held close to the ground, flames turn tough tubers soft and drive insects from sleeping places. Firelight also signals a kind of continuity that matters when the broader world changes. The eruption's legacy inside the human lineage is debated. Some genetic models have been interpreted to show a severe population bottleneck around this era, and a narrative of numbers as low as a few hundred or a few thousand survivors has been proposed. Other lines of evidence point to regional resilience and demographic structure that persists through the ash, with archaeological sequences in parts of South Asia and Africa showing continuity rather than break. The unresolved mystery is scale and timing, how much cooling, how long it lasted, how unevenly it fell across landscapes, and how strongly it pressed human numbers downward. What is agreed is that the eruption happened, that it injected sulfur into the stratosphere, and that its ash spread over vast distances. What remains open is whether it alone explains later expansions and contractions in our lineage, or whether it acted more as one stress layered onto existing climatic variability. In caves and rock shelters, people store a small memory of this time in materials that survive by chance. A length of worked bone shaped into a point lies beneath a thin ash lens. A grindstone with faint polish suggests roots processed at a riverside campsite. A crescent of footprints on firm, damp sand later buried crosses a strand line that will migrate as seas fall and rise. The days are measured by food found and water reached, and their movements follow gradients rather than plans upstream towards still pools in dry years downriver toward estuaries when the interior closes. On some mornings they see the world through a finer haze than before, and on others clear air returns after sweeping rains. Children learn to read wind off grasses and to watch birds for hints of shellfish exposed by low tides. They sleep under rock overhangs that face away from prevailing winds so that ash and dust settle at the edge rather than where they lie. They carry embers between camps to avoid the cost of starting new fires in damp conditions. The most durable fact in this section is simple and spare: a super-eruption. Toba creates a caldera that becomes Lake Toba and sends ash and sulfur into the high atmosphere with climatic effects at planetary scale. The smaller, lesser-known detail is that in some regions, far from Sumatra, cryptotephra from this very eruption is preserved as microscopic glass shards in lake cores and caves, allowing scientists to link thin layers by chemistry across continents. Between these facts sits the open question of survival numbers and roots, whether the demographic trough is drastic and global or variable and patchwork. The planet meanwhile turns. As aerosols settle and are washed from the sky, sunlight returns by degrees. Vegetation rebounds at different rates and the bands adapt in place or move along the paths they already know. In that return, beginnings take shape. The rivers that carried ash also carry silt that raises floodplains. New bars form new fords appear, and a mosaic of habitats spreads around each watercourse. The people present here are not progenitors in a heroic sense. They are continuities of earlier people using the same skills under slightly different skies. The day the sky turns dark marks a hinge in environments, not an end of a story, and it sets conditions under which later migrations become possible. When the winds finally settle and the seas take back their heat, the corridors they will follow already exist in outline, traced by rivers' shores and the steady need to move from scarcity toward enough. A species persists at small scales, families of a dozen bands of perhaps a few dozen, spaced by days of walking and linked by memory more than sight. In the seasons after the ash children live or do not live by margins, the extra marrow scraped from a long bone, the muscles pried from a cold rock ledge at low tide, the tuber roasted long enough to soften its fibres. They move at the pace of water and day length, and their security rests less in weapons than in maps held in the mind, where spring continues to seep in the third dry month, which Junefield conceals a lee face with fuel, which estuary bars are firm enough to cross before the tide turns. Demography here is not a statistic, but a shape on a landscape, a loose archipelago of groups that split and rejoin as food and kinship allow. Genetic diversity later suggests that effective population sizes in this era can be small, on the order of thousands rather than hundreds of thousands. And some scholars have proposed even deeper troughs, though such estimates measure breeding size abstracts rather than census headcounts. The scenario of extreme scarcity concentrates attention on refugia coastal shelves, exposed by lower seas river corridors with year-round flow montane belts where orographic rain still falls when plains go dry. Along shorelines stretched outward by tens of kilometres, bands build a dependable portion of their diet from shellfish limpets and fish stranded in rocky pockets, inland where ash never fell thick or is long since washed away. People cycle between lake margins, riparian groves and upland saddles that funnel migrating game. The fact that anchors this section is planetary in scope yet intimate in effect, with sulfur aerosols dimming sunlight and ice growing at higher latitude sea level, stands lower and climate belts shift, reconfiguring coasts, monsoons and the length of growing seasons. Against that moving backdrop, cultural threads continue. In southern Africa, Middle Stone Age traditions endure and will later give way to the Howisson's Port Toolkit after 65,000 years ago, a sequence that argues for resilience more than collapse. In South Asia, stone artifacts above and below layers containing Toba-derived glass shards show technological continuity rather than a break in archaeological signal that people remain on those landscapes through the disturbance. Lesser-known details add texture to survival. In rock shelters, microscopic residues on stone points record compound adhesives, plant resins tempered with fine ochre. To haft blades to shafts, a quiet technology that depends on controlled fire and careful mixing. In northwestern Africa and the Levant, small marine shells pierced for wearing appear deep in time. Some are recovered far from modern coasts, hinting at the movement or exchange along corridors that later vanish beneath sand or sea. On the exposed margins of continental shelves, now dry lagoons collect arcs of shells and char, and when the sea returns generations later, those faint middens drown and wait for future currents to cut them open again. The planetary scale observation remains inescapable as ice volume increases, coastlines extend, deserts shift, and wind fields strengthen, carrying more dust into oceans and across continents. Vegetation belts contract and expand with a lag, making the world patchy and forcing people to live inside mosaics of opportunity and risk. In that patchwork, social networks become survival tools as essential as stone. Bands meet at river junctions during wet intervals to exchange mate stories, pigments and tool's tone. During dry years, they withdraw into smaller territories and rely on known springs. The distance between gatherings might equal a journey longer than from Cairo to Delhi, when measured along meandering river courses and around salt flats. But the exchange of a few beads or a blade, blank, can carry information across that span where the ungulates now carve, which ford remains shallow, which stand of trees still bears fruit late. Their timescales are interleaved daily decisions about where to sleep, seasonal circuits between coast and interior, and generational knowledge about rare years when the rains come early or not at all. Children memorize the feel of wind that precedes a shift in tide, the shine of leaves that marks edible bulbs, the twisted grain in deadwood that burns hot and clean. Fire is constant company. Cooked starches yield more energy for the same effort. Warmth saves infants through cool, windy nights. Smoke pacifies biting insects. With embers carried in bark or shell, the cost of ignition drops and camps ignite quickly in damp weather. The unresolved mystery sits at the centre of many later arguments. How small do human populations become, and how even is that contraction across Africa and Asia? If some regions maintain relatively stable numbers supported by coasts, lakes or montane refugia, then the picture is one of uneven stress and local continuity. If other regions see sharp declines, then later expansions may trace back to a few lineages that persist through unfavourable years. Genetic bottleneck models and archaeological sequences do not always point to the same magnitude or timing, and so the conversation remains open. Was there one severe trough tied closely to the eruption, or a series of troughs set by broader ice age variability, with Toba as one of several pulses? What is clear is that people remain present in multiple regions through and after this interval, and that their tool traditions, pigments and hearths continue with adjustments rather than wholesale replacement. Fragility shows in spacing and redundancy. Camps cluster near dependable water, scouts range to sample edges, foraging parties travel with backup plans. A second spring, an alternate strand line, a known patch of edible sedges if the tuber ground is exhausted. In low humid forests where ash dampens the canopy, they cut paths that reopen older roots. In open grasslands, thick with dust, they watch the behaviour of grazers to find fresher forage and by extension fresher water. They cache stone at choke points, river narrows passes beachheads so that a future return does not depend on carrying every tool. The quiet arithmetic of fertility and mortality plays out inside these decisions. A mother who finds reliable shellfish in a lean month, a sickness that spreads less because groups camp farther apart, an elder whose memory of a seep on the lee side of a basalt floe saves a walk of half a day and the water it would have cost. Evidence accumulates slowly, a hearth lens rich in fishbone where the interior shows drought, a grindstone with residues of geophytes in a rock shelter above a dry valley, a ring of small footprints impressed in damp sand near an estuary bar. Each is a point on a map of coping strategies. The larger climate machine keeps turning. As stratospheric aerosols settle and wash out, the initial volcanic pulse relaxes, but the ice age envelope persists with monsoon belts wobbling and storm tracks shifting. Lakes rise and fall, dune fields migrate, river mouths cut new channels. The bands respond by stretching and folding their ranges, sometimes pushing into new corridors that the lower seas open, trails along reefs now high and dry. Dry passes across what will one day be zoofloor. In these movements lies the template for later expansions, a habit of following coastlines, a competence with estuaries, a memory for islands that stepstone outward when the tide is lowest and the wind is in their favour. The fact, the detail, the mystery and the planetary frame converge on a pattern rather than a scene. Small mobile groups that treat knowledge as a stored resource hold together by kinship and exchange and survive, because landscapes still offer enough if read carefully. In their continuity, the idea of an edge becomes less a cliff and more a narrow path, and they learn to walk it. Across Africa after the eruption, ash thins with distance, yet the atmosphere carries its effect. Light is filtered, seasons wobble, and water shifts its lines on the land. In the Rift Valley lakes breathe in and out with each change in rainfall, their shorelines stepping like faint terraces beneath cliffs, where people watch for hippopaths and reed beds that rustle with fish. Far to the north, the Sahara's not a single thing, but many, its face altering with the strength of monsoons that drift north or retreat south as the intertropical convergence zone migrates with warmer and cooler seas. When rains fail, dunes advance and lifeways contract into oases, and when rains return, paleo lakes occupy basins that will one day be names on maps. East Africa holds refugia springs at fault scarps, tufa mounds marking buried water, and river corridors that thread volcanic soils where ash becomes part of the ground. Here, Middle Stone Age traditions continue with local flavours, point scrapers and blades napped from quartzite basalt and chert carried from predictable outcrops. The fact that anchors this section is clear at planetary scale. The eruption injects sulfur aerosols into the stratosphere, perturbing radiative balance, cooling surfaces and shifting wind and rain belts that define Africa's habitability. In response, lakes, rivers and coasts reorganize, and people move within that reorganization rather than against it. The ground-level response is practical. Bands concentrate on ecotones, where two food webs overlap lake margin and woodland savanna and gallery forest, coast and estuary. On low-drowned coasts laid bare by lower seas, shellfish give secure calories while inland wetland edges provide sedges and geophytes that store starch underground through dry months. On basalt flows and granite domes above river plains, small camps reappear at the same overlooks, a circle of stones blackened by cooking fires, a scatter of flakes where cores are reduced until they fit inside a palm. A lesser-known detail lies in thin layers that settle in quiet water. Microscopic glass shards, cryptotephra from the Toba eruption, become lodged in lake sediments invisible to the eye, yet unmistakable in chemistry markers that allow cores from far-flung basins to be tied to the same event. Such traces become timelines against which pollen, charcoal and diatom shifts can be read, showing how plant communities adjust in the years and decades after the sky dims. In southern Africa, long cultural sequences proceed through the Middle Stone Age into Still Bay, and later Howisson's port phases, with new attention to finely made points and backed pieces. Though the precise timing varies by site, the broader signal is continuity through stress, innovation nested inside persistence. Along the northern margins, Aterian technologies with their distinctive tanged pieces persist in North Africa, sometimes alongside pierced marine shells that show wear from being strung and rubbed. Some come from contexts well inland, implying movement or exchange along paleo river networks and corridors that breathe with the monsoon. The unresolved mystery here is not whether humans remain present in Africa. They do, but how the eruption's pulse expresses across regions, whether it suppresses populations severely in some basins while leaving others relatively buffered, whether the strongest effects occur where monsoon dependence is highest, and whether the demographic fingerprints that genetics later detect owe more to this episode or to the longer cadence of Pleistocene climate variability. Evidence points in multiple directions. Continuity of tool traditions across the ash horizons in parts of South Asia and Africa suggest local resilience, while genetic inferences of reduced effective population size in this broad era hint at narrow passages at the species scale. People act within these bounds. In the rifts, they favour places where fractured bedrock forces groundwater to the surface, creating permanent seeps that rim pools even in lean years. They bank embers before sleep, and in the morning coals help roast cattail rhizomes and lilies that once charred and pounded yield digestible starch. On savanna edges, burned patches sprout green, early after first rains drawing grazers, and by extension, hunters who study spore and anticipate return paths to Vier. In rock shelters' hearth, lenses preserve botanical residues that speak to nightly comforts, a bedding of sedges, layered with aromatic leaves that reduce insects replaced and burned, when fouled an old practice that depends on knowledge of plant properties and on the control of small fires. To the east along the Indian Ocean, people range across coastal flats that are wider now than in warm times. They learn bars that can be crossed at low tide, and they cut shallow channels to empty pools faster, a small trick that gathers fish while the sun drops. To the west, Atlantic moisture sometimes reaches farther inland when circulation patterns tilt that way, keeping gallery forests along rivers alive, and saving travel days between water points. When the tilt reverses, those same corridors narrow and camps pull closer to springs. The planetary observation remains a constant contrast in their lives while they make choices at the scale of a day's walk. The ocean's surface cools or warms over seasons, the walker circulation breathes, the monsoon engine spins with more or less torque and ice, at far latitudes locks away more water, and keeps seas low, as coastlines extend and continental shelves stand in air routes open that are in length like walking from Nairobi to Khartoum, along meandering river strands, vast yet walkable given time and memory. Into this setting symbols travel. Ochre appears as ground powder on grinding stones and as smear in small cupules at shelter mouths. A few shells strung as beads carry polish at their apertures. The mark of bodies and time, and a drilled tooth wrapped and worn smooth suggests ties that stretch beyond single camps. These are not decorations as spectacle, but objects that bind groups and signal membership at river confluences, where bands meet in wet years to exchange mates and information. The social fabric absorbs environmental variability when lakes rise after several cool years, gatherings last longer, and foods are shared in larger circles, and when lakes fall, bands fragment, maintaining ties through gifts carried on foot beads in one direction, a blade core in another. The big unknown that threads through Africa's story in this interval is not a single number of survivors, but the map of survivals where clusters persist with little change in spacing, where others pinch narrow, and how often those clusters exchange partners, ideas and genes across landscapes that widen and shrink. Archaeology offers local snapshots, genetics offers average signals across time and space, climate proxies offer curves of lakes and winds. Together they outline a path of endurance with uneven pressure, in which some valleys and shores act as storehouses for people and knowledge, while others empty and refill with each swing of drought and rain. The contours of the future are faint but present. Habit formed along expanded coasts suggests how later groups will treat new low-lying corridors as the world cools further. A comfort with estuaries and strand lines prepares them for skirting peninsulas and sounds that in warmer times would be sea. Memory of springs in faulted ground sets the pattern for seeking water in new rifts to the northeast, and the habit of meeting at confluences rehearses the larger gatherings that take place when climates stabilize. The fact the lesser-known Cryptotephra markers the open mystery of regional demographic patterns, and the planetary observation of shifting belts cohere here into practice, careful reading of ground and sky, flexible use of ecotones, and an economy of movement that spends effort where it returns most. As years pass and aerosols wash out of the high air, Africa's lakes settle into new levels, forests regain crowns, and grasslands show the long wind-torn blades of cooler seasons. But the people who track them are the same lineage that preceded the ash, using the same core skills with slightly different timings. The ash that mixed into soils becomes part of the substrates on which seeds sprout, and the marks of camps become faint circles of darker earth beneath shallow rock shelters. From these places, paths radiate out to coasts, to paleo lakes, to river mouths, and eventually to corridors that lead away from the continent entirely, though for now the movements remain mostly inside Africa's variable heart, a continent large enough that a lifetime of travel might never cross it from Horn to Cape. What matters is that across rifts, deserts, woodlands, and coasts, people remain learning the next turn of water and wind and grinding ochre on stone until it mixes with fat and binds to skin, a small continuity beneath the high, slow machinery of climate. Along the Indian Ocean rim, the world rearranges itself into corridors of wind, tide, and light, and people learn those rhythms as if reading a long, slow script. Monsoon pressure patterns breathe across months the intertropical convergence zone, slides and coastlines expanded by lower seas lengthen into flats where mangrove sandbars and rocky shelves alternate like notes in a repeating phrase. Here the ocean becomes a quiet partner in survival, shellfish and crabs on spring lows, small fish trapped in rock pools as the tide turns sea turtles nesting in seasons. They can predict by stars as much as by temperature. The fact that anchors this section is broad and measurable with cooler seas and expanded ice at higher latitudes, global sea level sits tens of meters lower than in warm times, exposing continental shelves that convert drowned margins into walkable plains and braided estuaries. Those new lands create a coastal highway from East Africa past Arabia and the Indian subcontinent towards Southeast Asia, and along it small bands build a dependable portion of their diet from marine and estuarine resources whose timing is set by the moon. Camps cluster on lee sides of fossil dunes or limestone headlands where fresh water seeps out where rock meets sand. Embers are carried between sites to ensure hot coals for early tides before dawn. Stone tool traditions continue with local materials, silkrete, quartzite, chert, basalt, reduced on beaches where the sound of napping folds into surf. In some places, heat treatment of stone improves flaking quality. A quiet craft that depends on fire control and patience. Elsewhere, blades and points bear faint residues of fish mucus or plant starch, hints of mixed diets taken from shore and backdoor. Dune. A lesser-known detail lies beneath the breakers in layers few will ever see submerged terraces and paleochannels. Now on the continental shelf, once estuary mouths and campsites hold portions of the archaeological record that vanishes as seas later rise. Cryptotephra from the Toba eruption settles even here into marine cores, a microscopic tracer that lets scientists align distant archives to the same event. On the strand line at extreme low water, people pry limpets from rock with expedient flakes, lift stones to seize crabs by the back, and rake through shallow eelgrass for sea cucumbers and small bivalves. When a cresting tide floods fast, they step back to higher berms and tend fires that soften tubers roasted in beach pits, the smoke running low in onshore wind. Inland, a short walk, freshwater pools in interdune swales give drinking water without the salts of the estuary. Cattails and other sedges anchor those margins, their rhizomes dug, charred, pounded, and eaten. The planetary scale observation is visible even to eyes that never see a map. The surf line lies much farther from the old cliff lagoons, stretch where bays once were wind-blown. Sands migrate across wide flats and dust from continental interiors falls onto offshore waters, altering productivity where Upwelling occurs along the Arabian Sea and Bay of Bengal. In some years, monsoons strengthen and rivers pour fresher plumes into the sea. In others, they weaken, and salinity pushes farther up channels, changing where fish school and where mangroves can hold a root. People respond by lengthening or compressing their circuits to the coast in lean interior months, back to river groves when floods lay down silt and fruiting is rich. Along the Arabian shorelines during green phases, wadis flow longer and gather into deltas that breathe with the seasons. Later they shorten and leave stepped fans where people still find water by digging. Farther east along the Indian littoral bands learn bars that can be crossed at slack and set brush or stone into gaps to funnel fish on the falling tide. When storms rearrange the beach, those simple structures vanish and must be relearned by watching wave run up and the curl of foam. The unresolved mystery sits with the path itself. Did humans disperse mainly along this southern coastal route in a relatively continuous wave? Or did they move in pulses, with interior corridors taking precedence in some eras and coasts in others? Submerged shorelines conceal much of the record that would decide the question decisively, and so arguments turn on genetics on a few dateable shell middens, and cave occupations near modern coasts and on tools that match technological signatures across large spans. It remains possible that the coast serves first as refuge and later as conduit with local continuity, rather than a single uninterrupted highway. Yet the habits formed here, timed movement to tides, reliance on predictable littoral resources, comfort with estuaries and islands at short crossings, prepare for steps beyond what purely inland lifeways make obvious. Another quiet detail threads the Indian Ocean rim pumice and driftwood that wash ashore after far storms and eruptions, light materials that carry insect seeds and sometimes become abraders or fire carriers in human hands. A porous stone used to smooth a haft, or as a floating ember keeper, is a small invention born of attention. On headlands, people cache stone where view and water coincide, returning with the tidal calendar much as inland bands return to springs late in the dry season. Shell beads drilled and worn collect a polish that tells of bodies and time. Found far from the present coast, in some contexts they likely began on wider shores and travelled inland with exchange at confluences. Nights along these margins have their own routine. Fires are kept small to cut glare on eyes that read surf lines after dusk. Embers are banked in pits with damp sand so they smoulder to morning. Children learn to place bare feet on rock where algae are thin to test pools by hand before a wave folds in to watch herons and ospreys for signs of bait fish pushing into coves. A scale reference sits in the geography itself, the walkable edge between Mombasa and Mumbai. If traced along the exposed shelf with back and forth around inlets, spans a distance that would take seasons. Yet no single step exceeds the memory of a day's water and a night's fire. The sequence of facts remains steady lowered, seas expose shelves, monsoon belts shift, Cryptotephra from Toba records the same sky-darkening in marine as in terrestrial cores. Coastal resources offer stable, schedulable calories. The detail widens the picture drowned sites on today's seabed hold missing chapters that future currents and methods may reveal. The mystery tempers any single grand route into a set of regional practices that add up to movement. The planetary frame keeps time over the people who read it. Heat stored and released by the ocean moderates seasonal extremes, even as volcanic aerosols and then glacial cycles adjust baselines over decades and millennia. In this world, the ocean's edge is not a boundary but a fabric. When interior drought pinches hard bands drift seaward and tighten their loops around estuaries. When rains return inland and floodplains' green loops lengthen up river and coastal visits become shorter and more opportunistic. Across generations, knowledge of reef spars and islands accumulates. A headland passed at half tide without wetting the waste, a spit that closes after storms and reopens. When a river reasserts itself, a channel that sets fast on new moons, each becomes a line in a shared map. These habits will matter when stepping stone voyages become necessary, first across sounds and straits so short they can be seen end to end later, across channels that hide their far shores in haze. For now, the Indian Ocean keeps its long even pulse silent except for surf, and people keep time with it moving, where it offers enough, and withdrawing. When it withdraws, a companionship between tide and fire that leaves thin arcs of shell, dark stains of hearth and edges, where stone flakes gleam against wet rock before another wave clears the proof away. Across the hinge between Africa and Asia, a vast peninsula of limestone, basalt and dune fields opens and closes with the rhythm of rain. In humid phases, it becomes a chain of lakes and green corridors, and people move through it as if following a quiet river of water and time. Processional cycles tilt summer sunlight and pull the Indian Ocean monsoon northward. When the belt of rain strengthens and crosses the sea, clouds climb the escarpments of Yemen and Oman, spill across interior basins in the Nafud and the Rub al-Khali, and leave pale shorelines around newly formed lakes. The fact anchoring this section is simple and large during these Green Arabia intervals. Freshwater basins and active wadis spread across what is now desert, and evidence of Homo sapiens appears alongside them, most notably a human fingerbone from a paleo lake margin in northern Arabia, dated to roughly 85 to 90,000 years ago. An individual present because water drew animals and people to the same open shore. Speleothems in caves of Oman and Yemen grow in these windows, their calcite bands recording years when rain penetrates deep into the peninsula. When the bands end, dunes, advanced lakes retreat, and the corridor narrows to springs and scattered seeps where bedrock forces groundwater to light. Along those margins, camps cluster where evening shade falls on limestone benches and where shallow slopes lead to reed beds. Hearths blacken rock overhangs, and in the morning, embers are blown to flame to dry damp sinew and to set resin for hafting points. Tool traditions here carry the fingerprints of teaching Levallois preparation with preferential flakes and points persists, and in the southern highlands of Dhofar, a Nubian variant appears a core technology that some researchers read as a signal of movement out of northeast Africa into Arabia during one of these wet pulses. The lesser-known details lie at ground level, thin tufa mounds forming and where springs issue at fault steps, freshwater shells of species that need perennial flow, hippo and waterbird bones on lake margins in the Nefud, and at least one shore a tight cluster of human footprints pressed into wet sand beside the tracks of elephants and camels, a brief record of feet crossing an edge of water that no longer exists. These are small pieces, the mineral crust over a reed root, a polished shell bead recovered far from the present coast, a ring of ash pinned beneath a dune face, but together they mark a landscape where lakes are not mirages, but placemakers, and where people return in sequences paced by monsoon strength. Movement through the corridor has its own arithmetic. Bands treat lakes like beads on a string moving from basin to basin as water rises and falls. When rains slacken, they climb to escarpments where fog from the Arabian Sea wets face and rock, and when rains strengthen, they descend to plains where shallow shores push flocks of waterbird and herds of ungulate into narrow zones of grass. Distances are long but legible. A path from the Jubba Basins to the Dhofar Highlands measures more than a march from Jeddah to Muscat in straight line, and on foot it becomes seasons of travel with stops at fault-line springs and at wadis, where perennial pools hold fish turtles and reeds. Along the Red Sea margin lowered, seas widen the Tihama Plain and expose new flats and back barrier lagoons, where freshwater lenses collect above coastal sands. People can drink without the salt of estuaries and shellfish at spring. Low tide add predictable calories to inland tubers and upland game. Raw stone moves with people across these routes. Chert and quartzite show cortex and inclusions that point to sources tens of kilometers away. Caches of blanks left at lake outlets reduce the cost of the arriving empty-handed, and the presence of heat-altered stone at some sites suggests careful fire control even when fuel is scarce. Adhesives become quiet proofs of skill plant resins tempered with red ochre and fine ashite hold points in their sockets and resist heat and moisture, a recipe learned, taught, and repeated at new lakes where old wood burns fast and hot. Symbolic traces travel as well. Beads drilled from marine shells appear inland where no sea lies within sight. Their polished apertures and edgeware speaking to months or years against skin. ochre ground to powder smears into cupules on shelter walls and into grooves on grinding stones, a residue that marks skin treatment hide work, or the simply human habit of leaving colour where the hand already moves. Social ties bind the corridor together. Bands meet at reliable water during wet years to exchange mates' obsidian or chert nodules and knowledge about roots, then separate again when lakes shrink and waders fall silent. The memory of an especially long-lived pool or a gap in a dune ridge that offers easy passage can pass between groups with a bead or a blade core carrying guidance farther than any single walker travels in a season. The unresolved mystery here is not whether Arabia supports people in green phases. It does, but how it mediates the largest movements of the age, whether the peninsula functions mainly as a cul-de-sac where populations grow and then fragment with drying, or whether it is a true corridor, an interior pathway that channels dispersals toward Iran, South Asia and beyond, where the coastal margins hold the main southward route along the Arabian Sea, or whether interior basins and wadis aligned like beads serve as the primary line of passage. Much of the decisive evidence lies drowned on continental shelves or buried in dunes. Thus, arguments lean on genetics that detect shared ancestry across regions on a handful of lake-edge camps that can be dated on the presence or absence of technical signatures like the Nubian Levallois in Dhofar and their affinities to African sequences. While the answer remains open, the corridor's habitability in wet times is beyond doubt, and the skills learned here, reading wadis for flow after distant storms following animal paths to water late in the dry season, combining shoreline harvests with inland routes generalized to other edges in a cooling world. The planetary frame runs beneath every step. When ice expands at high latitudes, sea level falls and exposes more shelf along the Arabian and Persian Gulf coasts. When monsoons strengthen freshwater plumes push farther into the Gulf and along the Makran, shifting salinity and sediment in ways that change where mangroves can root and fish can spawn. When land dries, dust flux rises and falls across the Arabian Sea, altering the chemistry of upwelling and the productivity of waters off Oman. The Hadley cell and Walker circulation breathe, and with them the tracks of storms and the length of seasons. People live inside these shifts by adjusting loop size. They shorten circuits and cling to spring-fed basins in lean years, then lengthen loops to include coastal flats and Piedmont groves when rains return. Quiet economies of redundancy hedge risk a cached pile of stone at a wadi crossing, a remembered seep in a limestone bench, a strip of plant fibre wound and dried for cordage, a small pouch of resin and ochre kept near the coals. In this way, the Arabian corridor is less a road than a repeating pattern of opportunities that becomes a habit of mind. Follow water uphill when the coast withdraws, follow shells and fish when interiors close, and carry the memory of both, so that the next turn of climate finds the band already aligned with its offerings. In green years, it is wide enough to gather families at shorelines where birds call and hippos wallow. In dry years, it narrows to strings of springs and the shade of overhangs. And across both it trains a lineage to move by gradients and to make a living at edges, laying quiet ground for crossings yet to come. Out of Africa gain does not begin as a march, but as a widening of paths already worn by seasons, a set of corridors that tighten and loosened with rain belts, coastlines and wind. From the Horn and the Nile, corridors from Red Sea hinterlands and Saharan margins, small bands move east and northeast in pulses that align with windows of humidity and lowered seas. The Bab el-Mandab narrows when ice grows and sea level falls, and the Sinai route opens when steppe and sparse woodland bind Levant to northeast Africa. The planetary frame sets their options during marine isotope stage 4. The world cools, monsoons weaken and deserts expand, but sea level also drops tens of meters, exposing broad shelves in the Red Sea, Arabian Sea and Persian Gulf. In early Miss 3, the climate turns variable with intervals of stronger rains along some coasts and river systems. Within these rhythms, a subset of African populations carries lineages that will seed most peoples beyond Africa. Genetic evidence later resolves that nearly all non-African ancestry traces back to a dispersal in this broad window with mitochondrial lineages, M and N and Y chromosome branches that diversify soon after crossing out. The fact that centres this section is clear in its outline, if not in every detail. A successful expansion of Homo sapiens from Africa into South and Southeast Asia proceeds by late Pleistocene pathways that leave enduring genetic signatures shared across Eurasia and Oceania. Ground-level traces gather along the routes. On Arabian shelves and peninsulas, toolkits bearing Levallois preparation persist, and sometimes show Nubian core strategies that echo northeast African methods. Farther east in the Makran and Baluchistan uplands, Middle Paleolithic assemblages occupy caves and rock shelters overlooking seasonal streams. Across the subcontinent, stratified sites record continuous traditions that span the thin horizons, where microscopic shards from the Great Eruption still lie a signal that people remain present before and after the ash settles. Along the Indian littoral lower seas, reveal back barrier lagoons and river mouths braided across wide flats. Bands time their movement to spring tides, take shellfish and fish from creeks and rock pools, and carry embers in bark to light damp kindling at dawn. Inland circuits continue in parallel Piedmont groves and foothill valleys, hold edible bulbs, small game and wood for fuel, and passes over basalt and granite saddles stitch basins into seasonal ranges. A lesser-known detail from the African side of the departure underlines the social fabric that travels with them. Pierced marine shells from Panga Yasaidi in coastal Kenya, worn and polished by long use, appear in layers spanning roughly 67,000 years ago, and later suggesting personal ornament signals identity at gatherings where bands exchange mates and knowledge. That habit of carrying beads persists as people move along river mouths and shelves to the east, a portable signal that, like a prepared core or a resin recipe, can cross long distances folded into daily life. The unresolved mystery sits at the heart of many reconstructions, whether this dispersal pulses mainly along a southern route that skirts the Arabian and Indian coasts or includes large contributions from interior corridors through the Levant and the Iranian plateau. Whether movement is steady and continuous or episodic, advancing during wet phases and stalling during droughts, and how closely its timing relates to the super-eruption before, after, or overlapping. Submerged shorelines hide much of the decisive record beneath later seas, and interior dunes bury camps on old lake margins, so arguments braid genetics, a sparse archaeology, and climate proxies into scenarios that fit what is known without pretending certainty where it does not yet exist. What is visible in the living landscape is a logic of redundancy. Coastal bands maintain inland options, and inland bands learn estuaries and bars for lean months. As the Arabian corridor narrows with drying people who learned its lakes and wadies turn along the Gulf and Makran coasts or step into Iranian foothills where snowmelt feeds short-lived streams, as lower seas widen, shelves, estuaries reach farther seaward, and new flats appear where mangroves take root, creating a sequence of fords and crossing points visible from headlands at low tide. In South Asia's peninsulas and coastal plains, camps recur on limestone benches where fresh water seeps out below a cap of rock. Middens of shell and fishbone grow in thin arcs, and fire-cracked rock marks, cooking pits used and reused at the same spring-low moon after moon. On the Deccan, and in the rain-shadow basins to its East-Middle Paleolithic toolkits, continue across the thin grey lines that mark the tephra. Flakes and cores above and below share reduction strategies, an archaeological note of cultural continuity that argues against a sweeping ash-driven depopulation. The planetary observation remains their horizon. Ice grows and releases over millennia. Sea level falls by tens of meters, lengthening coasts by distances that stitched into a circuit rival, a walk from Khartoum to Karachi. Monsoon belts shift position and strength, making the world patchy and forcing lifeways to flex between coasts, river corridors and uplands. Through this patchwork, knowledge moves faster than feet. Toolstone sources are named and remembered. A bank of high-quality chert at a river elbow becomes a landmark across generations. Resin recipes for hafting plant gum tempered with fine ochre and ash travel with families and are remade from local materials when old sources run out. Beads and pigments bridge meetings at river confluences where inland and coastal bands intersect. A shell bead from a coast now far seaward of the modern line gleams at a gathering in foothills where tubers are plenty after rain. A small object that says we come from that edge without words. The expansion is not uniform in pace or direction. Some groups pause in refugia where fresh water and game hold steady through several lean years. Others push along bars and spits into gulfs that become long shallow bays in low sea stands. And still others follow Piedmont corridors eastward, where stone water and fuel align. Children learn to read winds that announce shifts in tide, to test sandbars before crossing to watch ungulate trails that converge on the last pool in a shrinking wadi. Fire remains a central technology. Cooked starch and protein pay back the effort of gathering. Smoke protects against insects. Embers carried in shell or bark make wet mornings shorter and safer. The scale of the movement becomes clear only in hindsight by late Mies-III people stand on river terraces in the subcontinent, in caves on tropical islands, and on platforms that look east toward drowned shelves. Within a few tens of millennia they will stand in Sahul, and later still they will cross land bridges into the far northeast. For now, the salient facts cohere genetic signals of a founding beyond Africa in this era. Archaeological continuity across ash horizons in parts of South Asia, coastal and interior lifeways that complement each other, and hedge risk. The open questions keep a quiet note in the story rather than a rupture, where the main streams of ancestry moved how many pulses there were, and which corridors mattered most under which climate. The migrants follow gradients rather than goals, but their gradients align across landscapes from lower to higher resource predictability, from narrower to wider windows of fresh water, from bare shelf to mangrove edge to dune ridge with lee shade and fuel. Each step holds close to a day's walk water and fire, but the sum of steps spans continents. They move into lands already occupied by other humans, and the encounter is not a clash of armies, but a long overlap of lives on shared ground. In the Levant's open woodlands in river valleys fringing the Iranian plateau, and along steppes that widen as climates cool, modern humans meet Neanderthals whose line has weathered hundreds of millennia in Eurasia. Farther east in mountain shadows and cavern mouths, traces of Denisovans known first from a child's fingerbone mark, another lineage living at altitude, and in forests that stretch toward the Pacific. The planetary frame sets the stage during late marine isotope stage 3 climate flickers between cooler and milder pulses. Ice grows and shrinks at high latitudes, and sea level stands low enough to extend coasts and dry interior basins. Across this shifting map, corridors open along steppe and parkland, inviting movement and contact. The fact that anchors this section is written in living genomes. Nearly all present-day people outside Africa carry about 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, a signature of interbreeding that occurs after the dispersal from Africa, and leaves segments long enough in early fossils to date the events to roughly 50 to 60,000 years ago. Some modern populations in Oceania and parts of island Southeast Asia carry additional Denisovan ancestry, often several percent evidence for at least one and likely multiple episodes of contact farther east. Ground traces echo the genetic record. In caves of the Balkans and the Caucasus in the Levant, and across Central and East Asia, stratified sediments preserve layers with Neanderthal tools and bones below or alongside layers bearing modern human remains and artifacts. At Bacho Kiro in Bulgaria, early modern humans around 45,000 years ago show Neanderthal ancestry within a few recent generations, and at Ust-Ishim in Siberia, a modern human femur of similar age carries long Neanderthal segments that have not yet been chopped short by recombination. In Romania, the ORZ1 individual stands even closer to admixture with a Neanderthal ancestor, only 4 to 6 generations back. Farther east in the Altai, a small bone from Denisova cave reveals in its ancient DNA a first-generation hybrid mother, Neanderthal father Denisovan, proof that these lineages also meet and blend among themselves. The lesser-known details reach into traits a gene variant in Tibetans that improves performance at high altitude, derives from Denisovan ancestry, an intragressed fragment that helps people thrive where oxygen thins. In island Southeast Asia, some indigenous populations such as groups in New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago retain some of the highest proportions of Denisovan-derived DNA, a memory of meetings that likely occur in or near Wallacea as people move towards Sahul. The landscape of contact is practical rather than grand, where steppes and open woods meet both lineages, hunt herbivores whose movements track grass and water. Where karst rises above river flats, both take shelter in caverns whose mouths face away from prevailing wind. Where spruce and birch advance and retreat with climate pulses, both tend fires whose smoke stains ceilings and hardens resins. Tool traditions differ in detail, prepared cores and points persist in Neanderthal contexts, while modern human layers sometimes show blade-rich reductions and bone or antler working, but both know adhesives, both cook, both carry embers between camps. At the scale of a day's walk, co-residents might be invisible. At the scale of generations, genes flow and leave their record. The unresolved mystery lies in the map and the number of meetings. Did the largest pulse of admixture happen in Southwest Asia soon after the dispersal, followed by smaller contacts as modern humans moved north and east, or were there multiple substantial episodes spread across corridors from the Levant to Central Asia and perhaps East Asia? Why do East Asians carry slightly more Neanderthal ancestry on average than Europeans? And do differences reflect multiple pulses, later dilution in Europe, or demographic events that change proportions over time? Where exactly did Denisovan admixture occur on the Asian mainland in several waves on islands, in Wallacea or both, and how many distinct Denisovan populations contributed? The fossil record remains sparse. Much of what would decide these questions lies in sediments not yet sampled or drowned on shelves that later sees cover. Another open question lingers farther south as modern humans spread through island Southeast Asia. Did they meet other archaic humans? Homo floresiensis and Flores Homo luzonensis in Luzon, and if so, did any genes pass between them? To date, no clear genomic signal of those island lineages appears in living people. But the archaeological record there is young and incomplete, and much of it lies on lands exposed only at low sea stands. The planetary observation threads beneath these uncertainties as ice grows, sea level falls by tens of meters, connecting lands and narrowing channels. As climates cool and dry open, habitats expand across mid-latitudes, encouraging wide-ranging grazers and the hunters who follow them. As climates tilt back, forests close and roots narrow. Against this slow alternation, the practical logic of contact repeats. Bands choose camp by water and fuel share space at resource bottlenecks and sometimes exchange more than glances. Mates move between groups. Young stay or go stories and techniques transfer in quiet, durable ways. Over time, small genetic additions prove useful. Some immune system genes introgressed from Neanderthals appear to affect responses to pathogens. The high-altitude EPAS1 variant from Denisovans helps with oxygen transport in Tibet. Skin and hair traits show patterns that likely reflect adaptation to new light regimes and temperatures. None of these fragments define modern humans. Instead, they provide marginal advantages that persist where they help. The emotional content of such encounters remains inaccessible. The archaeological content is thin but patient. In caves where both lineages leave traces, the soot that blackens ceilings, the butchered bones of deer and bison, the lenses of ash and char, and the repeating geometry of hearths tell a shared economy of heat and meat. The differences reside in how stone is reduced and which materials are favoured, yet even those gaps narrow when each borrows techniques well suited to local stone. A scale reference gives the space its breadth from the Levant to the Altai, is a span like walking from Cairo to Ulaanbaatar, and across that length the encounters are unlikely to be a single episode. Rather, they are a dotted line of meetings written into generations as terrain and climate allow. The best established fact remains the admixture itself, recorded in DNA and in the lengths of archaic segments in early modern fossils. The lesser-known details include the first-generation hybrid from Denisova cave and the high-altitude gene in Tibetans. The unresolved mystery concerns the frequency, locations and extent of contacts, and thus planetary frame is the Ice Age's choreography of corridors and barriers. In practice, modern humans learn Eurasia partly from those who already live there. They watch animal trails long known to Neanderthal hunters, sleep in shelters held warm by earlier fires, and find chert ledges favoured by others before them. Some tools and habits travel with them from Africa and Arabia. Others they refine for new stone, new prey, new seasons. The result is not a replacement across a single winter, but a shift in numbers and ranges over centuries with admixture as one trace of proximity. As their paths bend east and south toward the tropical islands and the shelflands of Sunderland, the memory of meeting other humans travels with them, carried in genes and techniques and in the habit of reading landscapes already read by others. Their next corridors lead into forests and over drowned plains where rivers once braided toward coasts and islands that fall and rise with the sea, and beyond them into reaches where a different human lineage also leaves its imprint in the people who pass. Between the Asian mainland and the islands that will later be named Sumatra, Java and Borneo, a continent appears and disappears with the sea, and people learn its rivers as they once learned coasts. During cold phases when ice grows and the ocean draws down by tens of meters at maximum by more than 100, the Sunda Shelf stands in air and binds the Malay Peninsula to the great islands, stitching their watersheds into a single low plain. The planetary frame is visible without maps. Shorelines march outward, the South China Sea becomes grassed flats and braided channels, and a trunk river drains a catchment the size of countries carrying silt from mountains into wide deltas that only briefly touch salt. Monsoon belts shift with the warmth of oceans and the position of the intertropical convergence zone. When summer rains strengthen, forests thicken across hills and basins, and when they weaken, open woodlands and grass patches extend along valley floors, a moving mosaic that sets where animals graze and where people can see far enough to plan a day's walk. The fact anchoring this section is clear. Modern humans occupy Sunderland in the late Pleistocene, adapting to rainforest edges, riverine corridors and mangrove-fringed lowlands that no longer exist. In Sumatra's karst, human teeth from Lieder Ager, dated to roughly 73 to 63,000 years ago, show that our species enters tropical rainforest early and persists there. In Borneo's Naya Cave, human remains and occupation deposits by 45 to 40,000 years ago, and later record foragers who take forest river and cave-edge resources over long spans. On Java and Peninsular Malaysia, caves and shelters preserve lenses of ash charcoal and bone that index repeated visits near springs and daylighted sinkholes on the now drowned plains margins. Across this landscape, lifeways adjust to shade and river light. Bands camp where limestone gives a dry floor and where skylight reaches enough for tasks. They set small fires that keep smoke low under roofs and harden resins used to haft points. On floodplains, they track the edge between gallery forest and open bank where game comes to drink. In swamp forest, they move by roots and hummocks, taking fish turtles and shellfish from blackwater creeks and mangrove channels where salinity rises and falls with the tide, even 100 kilometers from today's coast. Along levees they dig geophytes whose starch feeds families when hunting is lean. Inside caves they lay bedding of leaves and sedges that repel insects and are burned, when fouled, building thin ash lenses that pile softly against stalagmites and rockfall. A lesser-known detail lies in the microscopic record that clings to tools and sediment starch grains, and plant silica reported from Naya floors and nearby sites point to the processing of palm pith and tubers. Residues on edges hint at mixed diets taken from forest and stream, a quiet technology of pounding and roasting that pays back the effort in digestible calories. Another detail sits in what fails to survive, where bamboo and palm provide most working edges, and digging implements, stone tools are fewer and coarser, and the archaeological signal thins. The resulting record can make rainforest foraging look absent, where in fact it is simply written in perishable materials. Rivers reopen long paths through the green. The Paleosunda trunk and its tributaries braid across the shelf, their banks stepping with seasonal rise and fall. Floodwaters deposit slit-like ridges where camps return after each drop. People follow levees and cut oxbows at low stages to trap fish, a simple geometry of water and time. In dry pulses, the channel belts widen, and the surrounding forest opens, giving lines of sight that make tracking easier. In wet pulses, the understory closes, vines thicken and movement slows, but fruits and small game become more abundant nearer clearings where wind throws break the canopy. Mangroves advance and retreat with salinity along drowned valleys. When the sea is far, they root in estuaries still tens of kilometres from the modern shore, and their crabs, mollusks and fish give steady returns to foragers who time their visits to spring lows and slack turns. The unresolved mystery that runs through Sunderland's story concerns the configuration of habitats and how that structure shapes movement. Was there a persistent savanna corridor running roughly northwest-southeast across the shelf in cold phases, an open swathe between denser rainforests that would have guided both fauna and people, or did rainforest remain broadly continuous with only localized openings in river valleys and on seasonal floodplains? Pollen, charcoal and faunal data are patchy and sometimes contradictory. Some sequences imply more open conditions, others indicate stable forest canopies, and because the decisive archives now lie on the seafloor submerged beneath later seas, much of the map remains inferred. That uncertainty matters for life. Ways open belts favour visibility, large herds and longer daily ranges. Closed canopy belts favour trapping, fishing plant processing and small well-placed camps. In practice, people hedge the ambiguity by keeping both toolkits alive, edges for butchering and scraping pounding stones for palm tuber and nut processing, and by maintaining knowledge of river heights, mast fruiting cycles, and tidally influenced branches far inland. A scale reference sits in the distances made ordinary by low seas. A dry-foot walk from what is now Singapore to Borneo becomes a seasonal path across the shelf, and a traverse from the Malay Peninsula to Java, bending around low ridges and marshes rivals a march from Bangkok to Jakarta in length. No day's leg exceeds the span of a carried water gourd and a pouch of embers, but the sum of days covers a continent that later vanishes beneath water. Within caves, symbolic traces persist. Ochre smears on grinding stones and cave walls suggest pigments used on skin, fibres or surfaces. Beads of marine shell appear inland where no modern coast is near their polish and where telling of long use against bodies and the movement of objects between bands at river confluences and rock shelter gatherings. On high walls of islands beyond the shelf, later dates will anchor some of the oldest narrative scenes known in rock art. But even here on the shelf's edge, the habits that underwrite image-making, mixing ochre, preparing binders, selecting surfaces that catch light, travel with groups who already treat colour and to mark as parts of daily practice. The planetary observation holds the tempo glacial drawdown, exposes the shelf and quickens rivers, then interglacials drown the plain, push mangroves landward, and compress habitats against foothills. Monsoon strength waxes and wanes with insulations, moving belts of rain a few degrees in latitude enough to reset where forest closes and where grass holds. People ride these cycles by adjusting loop size and season. When channels run low and fish concentrate, camps stay longer on floodplains. When mast fruiting peaks, foraging nets widen to collect and process nuts and palm hearts. When the shelf starts to drown as ice retreats, bands climb with the coastline and learn new estuaries on higher ground. Through it all, fire remains, constant smoke clears insects. Embers speed mornings and heat turns fibrous starch into food that keeps children alive through lean months. In the record, the secure facts hold early rainforest occupation at Lida Aja, late Pleistocene foragers at Naya, shelf exposure by large sea level falls, and a lifeway that mixes rivers, caves and mangroves. The lesser-known details lie in residues and drowned sites. The open questions hinge on habitat patterns across the shelf and the degree to which open corridors structured movement. And the planetary canvas is the glacial breathing that writes and erases a continent. From this training ground at the edge of Asia, a habit forms that matters for the next step, reading tides and channels moving between islands at short crossings, carrying embers and maps in the head. When the time comes to look east from headlands where the far shore shows as a smear of darker air, those habits will frame the decision to go, and the memory of a plain now underwater will travel with them, as they measure wind and watch for slack water in channels that once were rivers. Beyond the great rivers of Sunderland, the sea never fully gives way, even at the lowest stand of ice. Deep straits keep their blue lanes, and a set of crossings must be made to reach Sahul, the single late Pleistocene landmass unites Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania. The planetary frame defines the possibility with ice locked on distant continents. Sea level lies more than 70 metres lower than today, exposing wide shelves and joining islands into peninsulas, yet the Wallace and Weber lines remain true barriers for land mammals and for people without boats. Between the last wooded ridge of the Sunda Shelf and the first beaches of Sahul stretch channels driven by trade winds and the Indonesian through-flow waters, whose surface hints at currents a walker can learn to read only from land. The fact anchoring this section is robust across methods humans enter Sahul by at least 50,000 years ago and likely earlier. Archaeological sites in northern Australia, such as Medjedbebe and Nawalabila, yield dates in the range of about 65 to 50,000 years ago, from layers with stone artefacts, pigments and plant remains, and early occupations in New Guinea's highlands and along near Oceania's coasts attest to a deep presence across the combined continent. Genetic data echo the antiquity and relative isolation of these populations, with lineages branching early from other non-African groups, then diversifying within Sahul. The crossings that achieve this are not a single leap, but a series of steps between islands and across open water that never narrows to zero. Even at the best of low sea stands, at least one leg requires open water travel on the order of 70 to 90 kilometres, a distance larger than a swimmer's horizon, and long enough to demand craft capable of carrying families, fire and tools. In the archipelagos of Wallacea, knowledge learned along Sunderland's rivers shifts outward to sea timing movement to slack water, watching seabirds and lines of ripples that mark current edges, reading the set of wind against swell. The boat forms remain invisible in the ground, but the toolkit around them leaves a trace. Camps on high benches above beaches contain hearth lenses rich in shell and the fishbone. Stone reduction continues with local materials and resins tempered with ochre bind points to shafts in a technology that tolerates spray and humidity. A lesser-known detail in northern Australia's early records signals both adaptation and innovation. Fragments of ground-edge axes appear early here, earlier than in many other parts of the world, alongside grinding stones bearing plant residues and ochre-stained crayons suggesting woodworking, plant processing and pigment use as part of first occupations. At Medjedbebe, thousands of artefacts, ground ochres with incised facets and botanical remains, such as pandanus nutshells and seeds, indicate broad-spectrum foraging from the outset. On New Guinea's side of Sahul, people soon climb into high valleys where grasslands spread during cool phases. Their early agriculture will much later take root. But in this era, the record shows fires tended in caves as bands traverse between river fans and montane ridges. The unresolved mystery sits on the water, which route or routes carried most people northern Chins via Sulawesi and Halmahera toward New Guinea, southern arcs via Timor toward Australia's northwest, or both impulses. Were voyages organised deliberately with departure windows set by wind and moon, and with enough redundancy to ensure arrival, or did smaller groups drift by accident, and only later stitch crossings into reliable paths? Modelling studies have argued that chance drift is unlikely to seed a continent at the observed scale, without many losses. While demographic inferences from genetics imply founding numbers larger than a single boatload, yet the archaeological record of boats is absent, and drowned shorelines hide many decisive sites beneath later seas. Another open question concerns the exact timing of the earliest landfall. Some dates press toward the older end of the range, others cluster nearer 50,000 years, and debates turn on site formation sampling and the interpretation of luminescence clocks in sediments. What is clear on land is a competence that fits the voyage. In northern Australia's stone, early occupants select pieces whose fracture yields dependable edges and points. Grinding stones carry plant starches that speak to geophytes, and seeds ground into foods that store a hedge against lean spells between seasonal booms. Pigments are abundant ground and used on the body's bindings or surfaces. In coastal dunes, small camps reappear at freshwater soaks where the water table touches sand. Along rocky headlands, shell middens speak to schedulable returns keyed to spring tides. Inland on sandstone plateaus, shelters with smoke-stained ceilings and tool scatters overlook plains where marsupials graze and wooded watercourses thread a path to permanent pools. Fire remains the central technology carried embers shorten mornings. Heat unlocks calories and hardens wood. Controlled burns around camp clean insects and encourage green pick that draws animals. And the same skill set that keeps a hearth viable through a wet squall also keeps pitch workable for hafts repaired at dusk. A planetary scale observation continues to shape choices after arrival. Sahul's coastlines lie far seaward of modern lines exposing the Arafura Plain north of Australia, and the Carpentaria lowlands as broad grasslands. The Torres Strait is dry ground joining Australia to New Guinea. Wind and rain belts shift with glacial pulses, moving savanna and forest edges back and forth across ranges the length of a march from Port Moresby to the Kimberley, if measured in steps. As ice retreats in later millennia, the sea returns to drown shelves, sever land bridges and isolate populations. Tasmania will separate from mainland Australia and New Guinea from Cape York, but in the early phase the continent is continuous, and people move across it following water and game. Another quieter detail of first settlement sits in the tempo of obsidian movement in near Oceania. Soon after arrival in the Bismarck archipelago, people transport obsidian between islands separated by tens of kilometres, a signal that once basic crossings are mastered, networks extend and exchange becomes routine. On Sahul's mainland, a scale reference grounds the distances without analogy from a beach on the Timor Trough's western rim to the first low hills of northwest Australia is a sea passage that even at the lowest sea levels demands sustained travel across water longer than a day's walk would cover on land, and the return trip against wind or current doubles the requirement unless a circuit is made along alternative islands. Such margins make knowledge the reserve that matters. Crews choose dawn departures on neap tides, align their bows with wind stripes on the water, keep fire in covered shells or logs, and carry spare bindings for lashings that may work loose with spray. The secure facts arrival by at least 50,000 years ago, early occupations in northern Australia and New Guinea required open water segments across Wallacea and rapid establishment across a united Sahul stand with little controversy. The lesser-known details, early ground-edge axe fragments in northern Australia, ochre crayons with faceted wear plant residues on grinding stones, early obsidian movement between islands, add texture to lifeways that meet new wood, new foods and new coasts with practiced skill. The unresolved mysteries, the exact routes, craft types, voyage, planning founder sizes, and the tightest bounds on first arrival remain to be narrowed by work on drowned shelves and better clocks. Through all of it runs the planetary frame ice and sea level set the length of coasts and the width of channels. Winds and currents set the timing of safe crossings, and later rising seas will pull apart the single continent and strand memories of first voyages on headlands far inland from future shores. For now, those first steps ashore leave thin arcs of shellflakes that gleam where sandstone breaks and hearth stains on cave floors above flood lines, a record written by people who treat water as another corridor, and whose maps now include what the wind says when it speaks across a low swell. Ice draws down water from the oceans and lays it as weight on high latitudes, and with that weight the world changes shape, seas fall, winds sharp, dust rides farther, and a broad belt of steppe tundra spreads from the Atlantic plains across Eurasia into Beer and Year. People meet this colder, drier map by lengthening sightlines and tightening routines. They walk along river terraces that remain unfrozen in winter where groundwater keeps channels breathing, and they place camps on lee slopes above floodplains so that wind scours snow from paths between hearth and water. The planetary scale observation is unambiguous and measurable. The last glacial maximum peaks roughly between about 26 and 19,000 years ago, when global sea level sits more than 100 metres below modern, and ice sheets cover much of northern North America and northern Europe. Dust flux increases, desert belts expand, and the mammoth steppe biome links grass and forbee communities across distances that rival a march from the Atlantic coast of France to Mongolia. Within this envelope, lifeways converge on reliability. End scrapers' thin hides, bone awls and eyed needles stitch tailored clothing from fur and skin. Sinew twisted and dried becomes thread that holds seams tight against wind. In treeless plains where driftwood is rare, people burn bone-dense limb fragments and long bones split for marrow that once grease is rendered still feed the fire. Such hearths leave pale, chalky ash rich in carbonates and are found at many Upper Paleolithic camps. A lesser-known detail of fuel economies in landscapes where wood grows thin. Mammoth, horse bison, reindeer, and saiga move along isochrones of snow and forage, and hunters key their circuits to those movements, reading the tight funnels where herds cross low saddles or river narrows. In the less plains of Central and Eastern Europe, rings of mammoth bones and jaws at Mezhirish, Mezin, Gontsi, and other Dnieper-Desna sites form windbreaks, or houses with internal hearths dug pits, and work areas oriented to prevailing winter winds, a resilient architecture that reuses the massive leftovers of hunts and scavenging. Farther north and east, open-air camps perch on high terraces with views over frozen rivers. In Siberia's high Arctic people stand at Yana, on the lower Indigirka by about 32,000 years ago, living above the Arctic Circle among willow scrub and driftwood, a fact that marks one of the earliest sustained human presences at such latitude. Toolkits reflect a preference for composite weapons in space. Where encounters are at range, bladelets struck from prepared and wedge-shaped cores are set into wood or antler to form cutting edges and barbs. Later in the sequence, microliths and backed pieces multiply in some regions as hunters refine portability and repairability. Leverage devices to cast dart spear throwers appear and spread in Upper Paleolithic layers, increasing throwing velocity and effective distance, and in some areas pressure. Flaking produces delicate points with consistent geometry. Adhesives, birch tar resin tempered with fine ochre and ash bind inserts. Pitch warms near coals even in air far below freezing and is reworked with fingers toughened by cold and fire. The open questions in this world concern both climate choreography and human roles in the fates of large animals. How uneven is cold and aridity across regions at different times? How often do abrupt warming and cooling pulses jolt habitats? And to what extent do human hunting pressures as landscape burning and corridor use contribute alongside climate to declines in woolly rhinoceros, steppe, bison and mammoth? As the Pleistocene ends. The record varies by species and place. Some extinctions cluster with rapid climate shifts, others with human arrival, many with both, and because causes overlap, the debate remains unresolved in detail, even as broad patterns are recognised. Day to day, the solutions are pragmatic. In winter, eads are layered hair in hair out to trap still air. Boots are stuffed with dry grass that is replaced each night. Sleeping platforms are raised above frozen ground with bone and wood. Windbreaks are banked with snow to seal drafts. In treeless locales, marrow rendered in skin bags thickens into a storable fat. Frozen meat caches are pegged and marked against snow. Sinew is dried indoors so it does not ice burn and lose fibre strength. Where willow and dwarf birch grow along streams, straight shafts are harvested and seasoned above hearths, rotated until true. On river ice in late winter, people cut drinking holes where current keeps water moving. When thaws begin, camps shift upslope to avoid break-up floods that can shear away banks overnight. The scale of their ranges becomes legible in season. A loop from a mammoth bone dwelling site on the Dnieper to a favoured flint bank and back might take weeks, and further east the drift across the Obyenisay-Lena basins can equal a journey from Krakow to the lower Amur if stitched through several winters and summers. Knowledge carries farther than feet. Sources of high-quality chert flint and chalcedony are named in memory and revisited. Antler and ivory are worked into foreshafts and wedges. Beadwork and carved bone carry marks and motifs that travel between wintering groups when river valleys open in spring. Fires at these latitudes do more than warm and cook. They anneal stone for better, flaking smoke dry meat and fish, harden wood for points and dig in sticks and keep adhesives workable. Clusters of reddened earth and fire-cracked rock become the most persistent features in camps whose perishable parts vanish with thaw. Another lesser detail hides in the cooking stones heated in fire and dropped into skin bags of meltwater, bring stews to a simmer where wood-fired pots are absent. The small rounded pot boilers split and craze with thermal shock and accumulate in modest piles that mark kitchens in places without ceramics. Planetary drivers continue to set the framework even at the hearth scale. Low atmospheric CO2 reduces plant water use efficiency and favours open-steppe taxa. With albedo high over ice sheets, westerlies and storm tracks shift, changing the snow line and the length of safe seasons for long hunts. Dust blown from exposed shelves and glacial outwash feeds iron to oceans and alters productivity, an invisible teleconnection that affects climate feedbacks at continental distances. On land, Beringia stands wide and dry, a grassland plain joining Eurasia and Alaska. It holds steppe bison, horse, mammoth, and people who learn its rivers and winds, and who will in time follow them east and south when ice margins and coastlines allow. Technology and social fabric that sustain life here are conservative because they work composite points that can be repaired with a few bladelet sewing kits that vanish into a pouch fire starting. Kits kept dry in bone tubes and the habit of caching stone and fuel at choke points for the return leg. Children learn to read sastrugi, the wind-carved snow that tells direction and drift, and to hear the hollow under ice that warns of thin places near current. Dogs do not yet leave an unambiguous mark in this early high-latitude record, but wolves watch camps and trails, and in later millennia their partnership with people will become clear in finds from Arctic islands and inland camps. For now, tracks overlap without certainty. What can be said with certainty is that these populations keep living where winter dominates most of the year, and that their record shows continuity through harsh intervals as well as flexibility when brief warmings open forests and widen ecotones. The cold does not stop symbol or story. Engraved bones, beads of ivory and shell, and occasional figures carved from mammoth tusk or fired losses appear in camps along rivers and under rock shelters. Ochre still smears on grinding stones and on skin. Music comes from bone flutes in some regions, the sound held inside dwellings where snow walls and hides dull the wind. Yet this section holds the art in the background, because what matters to survival is the routine, the rotation of clothing to keep ice from accumulating in seams, the selection of bone dense enough to burn long, the choice to face a doorway away from prevailing wind, and the timing of a move so that a thawing river does not trap a band on the wrong bank. Facts stand the glacial peak and its sea level fall, early high-latitude settlement at Yana, mammoth bone structures on the East European plain, composite projectiles and tailored clothing, bone fuel used where wood is sparse. The lesser-known details, carbonate-rich white ash from bonfires simmering, with pot boilers needlework that leaves polish on fingers and edges give texture. The unresolved mystery's exact roles of climate and hunting in megafaunal declines, the pacing and patchiness of cold across corridors keep humility in the narrative. And the planetary frame, the breathing of ice sheets and winds, remains the quiet metronome. As seasons turn on the steppe, the habits formed here will travel with people who later cross a land bridge wide as a country and stand where another continent begins, still reading snow-wind water and the long shadows of animals moving over pale grass. As ice recedes and seas rise, the great land bridges that once spanned continents dissolve, pulling the world's human populations into their final arcs of isolation. The rising waters of the Holocene gradually erase the connections between land masses that had once been so wide and welcoming. What was once a single landmass becomes fragmented, and people who had lived together for tens of thousands of years on a unified Sahel now find themselves divided, living on islands with no natural bridges back to the mainland. The planetary frame holds the sweeping change as glacial ice melts sea level, rises at a rate that accelerates over thousands of years, and coastlines stretch inward to reclaim what had once been fertile, well-travelled lands. New landforms emerge in the wake of these rising seas, such as the islands that will form the modern-day islands of the Indonesian archipelago New Guinea and Tasmania marking a shift to smaller, more isolated worlds. This marks the end of the Great Migrations and the beginning of a time when the journeying of humans becomes a localized affair, moving from one island to another, not across continents. The fact anchoring this section is the last sea level rise during the Holocene, which transformed coastal corridors into islands and blocked the interconnections of the populations living across the Indo-Pacific region. As seas rise, the now submerged Sunda Shelf, which once connected Southeast Asia with Sahul, is lost, and the world of early humans becomes sharply fractured. On the islands of New Guinea, Australia and Tasmania, however, humans carry on creating vibrant and distinct cultures in isolation. In these new islands, human populations diversify and adapt to their environments. On Tasmania, for example, the harsh and cold conditions shape a unique way of life for its inhabitants, with extensive knowledge of the environment, including the intricate use of tools to process plant materials and hunt in dense forests. The lesser-known detail in this section is found in the persistence of certain cultural practices, such as the creation of intricate bone and wood tools that persist in some isolated communities far into the Holocene. At sites like Lake Mungo in Australia, the first evidence of human burial rituals and organised settlement emerge. These people, as isolated as they are from the rest of the world, continue to live by the same principles that had guided their ancestors before the great rise of the sea, relying on a deep knowledge of their environment and the animals that lived alongside them. Some regions experience even more dramatic shifts. As sea levels rise, certain plants and animals are driven to extinction or are pushed into new niches, while others flourish. These changes are often abrupt, creating periods of uncertainty and risk, but they also spark new opportunities for those who are able to adapt. The unresolved mystery lies in how these isolated populations left to evolve on their own islands develop distinct features. Did they simply adapt to the new environments, or were their cultural innovations shaped by these sudden shifts in geography? Were the innovations they created driven by necessity, or by something more intrinsic to their human nature, the desire to survive against the changing world around them? What patterns of cultural evolution emerge when entire populations are cut off from others? While the evidence we have from archaeology points to many distinct adaptations, the full picture is still not entirely clear. A crucial question remains: did these isolated populations interact with one another in any meaningful way, or did their isolation deepen with the rise of the seas? Some argue that there were still limited exchanges even between distant islands through occasional trade routes or shared maritime knowledge. Yet others maintain that these islands were truly cut off from one another, with communication and trade dying down as distances between islands widened and sea levels rose. From a broader planetary perspective, this is not just the end of the migration, but the final boundary of human adaptation to the Earth's changing rhythms. As the world slowly stabilized, with ice retreating and climate stabilizing into patterns we recognize today, human life found its niches across the fragmented landscapes of the Earth's continents and islands. Some groups of humans, no longer needing to migrate, found new ways to settle planting roots in the familiar soils they knew best, while others somewhere in the more fertile parts of Europe, Asia and the Americas began the early stages of agricultural revolution. Yet the fact remains that for those living on the islands like Tasmania or New Guinea, their histories became one of static isolation rather than expansion. The diversity of environments, tropical rainforests, dense temperate woodlands, arid deserts and cold tundras, allowed for an explosion of technological development, cultural complexity and linguistic diversity across the world. The settlements on these islands became deeply entrenched within their environments. Humans on the island of New Guinea, for example, learned to use the land's dense forests for a variety of needs: food, shelter and medicine, while also honing unique artistic and cultural practices, with intricate stone tools and ceremonial clothing becoming symbols of group identity. As the sea level continued to rise, those left behind on isolated islands found new ways to thrive. Some of these islands became havens for unique species of plants and animals, while others became refuges for cultural practices that survived longer than elsewhere. In Tasmania, for example, evidence of complex hunting practices and social organisation among hunter-gatherers becomes apparent. Over time, these practices evolve into ways of life that span millennia, even as other regions experience greater changes. The scale reference here is more than geographical. The isolation and specialization of groups in these island settings become a microcosm of human diversity on a planetary scale. Where once there had been paths open across continents, the world now splinters into smaller units, each shaped by distinct environmental factors and evolving over time in different directions. The social fabric that holds these islands together is marked by a long-term adaptation to the local environment, and their cultures reflect the skills needed to manage the land they inhabit. From coastal fishing settlements to highland agricultural terraces, the full spectrum of human life on these islands mirrors that of the broader world, though divided by the boundaries of geography and time. A subtle interplay of geography, climate, and human ingenuity governs these lives, preserving cultures on these isolated islands until the present day. In the long, slow turning of time, the world moves toward modernity. Yet the final snapshot of humanity's early years is drawn in isolated islands, where innovation, adaptation, and resilience shine through the lingering traces of the ancient world. From these islands, human life will spread again, but this time with knowledge and culture learned from the Earth's shifting boundaries. In the quiet stillness of these islands, however, a different rhythm played out a final testimony to the human ability to thrive despite enormous challenges. It was not migration that brought people here, but the deep connection they formed with the land once they arrived. Across the high latitudes, a plain as broad as countries rises, where the sea has withdrawn grass and sedge, binding Lues into low swells between braided rivers. This is Beringia, a land bridge and a homeland at once joining Siberia to Alaska, while ice sheets to the south and east hold fast. The planetary frame sets the possibilities with the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets at or nearing their maxima and global sea level more than 100 meters lower. Then today, the Bering Chukchi shelves stand dry. The North Pacific Rim supports rich kelp forests along cold currents and interior corridors, open and close as climate flickers through millennial pulses. Bands that have learned wind shelves and estuaries now live within a steppe tundra, where willow scrub clings to stream margins, and herds of horse bison and mammoth move by snow depth and forage. In this wide country, a standstill in population takes shape as people remain for generations on the bridge, and its flanks their genes diverging from Siberian kin while ice walls limit movement south. The fact anchoring this section is clear in genetics and archaeology together. The founding ancestry of indigenous peoples of the Americas separates from Northeast Asian sources during the late Pleistocene with a prolonged Beringian phase, followed by dispersal into the continents. By at least the late glacial people are south of the ice, and by the early Holocene they range from subarctic forest to southern pampas. The ground record marks the stages unevenly. In the far north sites on the lower Yukon and the Tanana Basin track foragers by 30 to 14,000 years ago. Farther east in the Yukon, bones from bluefish caves have been argued to carry cut marks older than 20,000 years, claims still debate. South of the ice, the constellation of pre-Clovis sites, Monteverde, in southern Chile, with preserved woodhide and plant, remains older than 14,500 years. Page Ladson in Florida, with mastodon butchery around the same horizon, and stemmed point traditions along the Pacific Northwest, now stands as a durable pattern that places people beyond the ice margins before the brief late opening of the interior corridor. Along the Pacific Rim shell, middens, waterlogged camps and caves with fishbone and sea mammal remain support a lifeway tuned to tides and kelp, though many early shorelines now lie drowned. On Calvert Island off British Columbia, human footprints pressed into intertidal clays about 13,000 years ago preserve a moment of people moving between rocks and tide pools, a lesser-known detail that captures presence at the edge where land and sea share a calendar. The unresolved mystery threads through timing and route. How early do people stand south of the continental ice, and by which pathways do most move an interior corridor that becomes ecologically viable? Only as the last glacial wanes around 14 to 13,000 years ago, a Pacific kelp highway, used earlier along productive ice-free coasts or pulses, of both radiocarbon chronologies, luminescence ages, and ancient DNA converge on scenarios with coastal entry before the corridor is green enough to sustain a full passage, but drowned shores hide decisive sites and leave room for revision. A deeper question remains at the older edge of the record footprints at White Sands, New Mexico, dated by multiple methods to more than 20,000 years ago, imply people on a pluvial lake margin during the height of glaciation. If those ages hold, they lengthen the timeline and complicate models that tie departure from Beringia to the very end of the Ice Age. On the bridge and its flanks, daily practice fits the map. Camps lift onto bluffs overlooking frozen rivers. Bone and driftwood fuel hearths that warm, cook and keep pitch workable for hafting. Bladelets set into antler or wood form composite points that can be repaired when a barb breaks. Marrow is rendered and cached through the long night. When spring advances, people watch open leads on the coast where seals surface, and on interior floodplains they intercept caribou and bison at narrow crossings. Dogs move into the records soon after the southward dispersal companions that share heat, pull loads and scent trails. Their remains present by at least the early Holocene in many regions, and perhaps late Pleistocene in the subarctic, mark a partnership that amplifies mobility at high latitudes and in forests. South of the ice landscapes diversify quickly. In the Pacific Northwest, conifer forests climb slopes, while paleo shorelines, now tens of meters below modern seas, once held kelp-lined bays where fish, shellfish, and sea mammals could be taken on a schedule. Inland on the Columbia Plateau and the Great Basin margins, stemmed points, net weights, and plant processing stones speak to mixed economies around lakes that grow and shrink with climate. On the Great Plains, later mammoth and then bison hunts leave bone beds at river bends. In the east mast, forests and riverine wetlands offer fish runs and nut harvests that structure seasonal rounds. The planetary scale observation remains the metronome. Deglaciation pulses alter meltwater routes, jolt ocean circulation and raise seas stepwise. Isostatic rebound lifts some coasts, even as eustatic rise drowns others. The ice-free corridor shifts from a barren trough between lobes into a habitable valley only after vegetation game and water networks establish a lag that matters for any model that uses it as a main route. Through this choreography, knowledge moves faster than feet. River fords obsidian sources, mast fruiting cycles and salmon runs enter shared maps. On the coast, the positions of kelp beds and the timing of tides frame safe travel between headlands. Inland, the depth of snow in passes and the advance of green-up in spring-queue crossings. A scale reference grounds the distances from the lower Colima lowlands to the mouth of the Columbia traced as a chain of seasonal moves equals a walk longer than from Lisbon to Moscow stitched over years. No single step exceeds a day's water and fire, but the sum traverses a continent. Symbol and memory travel with the dispersal. Pigments smear on grinding stones and on skin. Beads of shell and tooth cross between groups at river confluences. Carved objects in bone and wood appear in wet sites where oxygen-poor sediments preserve them. And in caves and rock shelters, ochre marks and hand stencils accumulate over thousands of years in patterns that vary by region, but share the habit of leaving trace. Another lesser detail sits offshore drowned forests and channels mapped on the Hecate Strait seabed, and along Haida Gwaii, show paleo landscapes that once supported camps, freshwater and travel on foot, a reminder that the earliest coastal sites are often invisible beneath modern seas. Facts, details, uncertainties and planetary context converge into practice. People read the retreat of ice as a widening of choices, not a summons. When the interior corridor greens, some bands use it to connect basins already occupied from different directions. When seas rise, others shift camps upslope and refit their coastal rounds to new headlands. When herds change composition with warming, hunters recalibrate tactics and tools. By the time glaciers withdraw to high mountains and the Holocene takes hold, the Americas hold a patchwork of lifeways from Arctic coasts to southern grasslands. Descendants of bands that learned Beringia's winds crossed water by tide and star, and walked river by river into a continent whose scale they measure in seasons and fires rather than in maps. Symbols take shape in the quiet margins of daily work on the backs of grinding stones, where ochre is turned to powder at the lips of caves where hands become silhouettes, and in burials where beads gather like patient hours turned into small repeating light. After the great ash of Toba settles and seasons reassert themselves, the habit of marking, adorning and arranging does not begin so much as widen. Practices present before the eruption continue and spread along new routes as people move through coasts, corridors and plains. The planetary frame sets the tempo ice grows and relaxes. Across marine isotope stages 4 and 3, deserts and woodlands breathe with the monsoon, and coastlines advance and retreat by tens of kilometres, opening and closing galleries, river mouths and cliffs that invite shelter and surface for mark-making. In this breathing world, pigments, shells, bones and stones become means to stabilise memory and affiliation. The anchoring fact is firm in its outline by roughly 70 to 40,000 years ago. Anatomically modern humans across Africa, Southwest Asia and Eurasia repeatedly produce symbolic objects and images, engraved ochres and ostrich eggshells in southern Africa, pierced shells in North Africa and the Levant, hand stencils and figurative paintings in Europe and Ireland, Southeast Asia, carved ivory figures and abundant ornaments in the Upper Paleolithic, evidence that symbolic expression is a widespread and durable part of human behaviour. At Blombos and other southern African sites, ochre is ground and engraved, and shell beads accumulate in layers that speak to repeated use across long spans. Adhesives prepared with plant gum and finely powdered ochre show up on points in the Howisson's Paw, a quiet chemistry that doubles as body colour and binder. To the north, in caves of the Levant and North Africa, small marine shells pierced for wearing carry polish, implying weeks and months against skin. Far later in time, but essential to the same thread, Sungir in the Russian plain yields burials of people laid with thousands of ivory beads, bracelets and spears, each bead drilled and polished, labour measured in thousands of hours and then placed under earth. Eastward and southward, hands appear on stone negative stencils from Europe and Indonesia, echo across latitudes and in Sulawesi and Borneo, early figurative images, wild pigs banteng, and human-animal scenes fix hunters and animals in pigment that will outlast climates. A lesser-known detail hides in the small, portable things that carry news, farther than voices. Ostrich eggshell beads into southern Africa change style and size through time, and their distributions map social networks that tighten and loosen, with climate linking groups across distances that in some rival a walk from the Kalahari to the Cape. Elsewhere, the red of ochre in some graves comes from sources tens of kilometres away, and the wear on bead apertures shows they were not made for burial, but lived as ornaments before being set aside with the dead. In caves of the Swabian Jura, mammoth ivory becomes small flutes and figures. At Hohle Fels and Geisenkluster bone flutes appear near 40,000 years ago, sound makers whose tones fill spaces also marked by carving and beads. Music joins colour and form as a way to bind gatherings when winter pushes camps into shelter. The unresolved mysteries do not concern whether symbol exists. Its presence is beyond argument, but rather how and why it blooms in particular places and times are the geographic spreads and bursts of image and ornament driven mainly by demography. Larger, denser, better connected populations that can sustain specialists and transmit styles, or by environmental pulses that force groups together, are resource bottlenecks where exchange accelerates. Do independent inventions converge on similar solutions? Hand stencils, beads, engravings because materials and hands share constraints, or do styles ride the same social networks that carry mates and resin recipes? Another open question sits at the start line. How far back does symbolic marking run in our lineage and in others? Are some Neanderthal ornaments and cave marks evidence of their own symbolic traditions sporadically expressed and now thin in the record? Or are they adoptions from contact with incoming moderns? The debate remains active and careful, because early pigments and incisions can have multiple uses, and thin layers compress time. The conservative reading keeps the story open without denying the clear later abundance. Day to day, the making of Symbol is folded into ordinary tasks. Ochre is collected where iron-rich veins weather out of rock, or where streambeds trap heavy grains. It is ground on sandstone mixed with fat or plant juice, and applied to hides to aid tanning to bindings to strengthen adhesives to skin as colour that signals season and membership. Shells are picked from shores timed to moon and tide, drilled with stone or bone strung on sinew, and worn until edges round and polish. Beads sometimes travel inland along the same corridors that move toolstone, so that a string made at a coast can appear weeks later at a river confluence, where inland and littoral bands meet. Engraving flows from habits already in the hand, scraping hides, scoring notches to tally testing edges before a cut. On ochre and bone, the lines Yiddi sometimes repeat and compose into cross-hatching and chevrons patterns that stabilise as a style in a camp, and then carry into the next season. Inside caves, torchlight finds panels that catch and hold the faint flame. Hands are placed and sprayed, animals are outlined with lines that follow anatomy learned by watching, and in some cases pigments are prepared with binders that endure humidity and time. The planetary observation remains in the background of each mark. When deserts expand, gatherings may shrink and styles fragment. When wet phases open corridors and lakes, gatherings swell and styles blend. When sea level falls and coasts widen, shell sources multiply and bead exchange accelerates. When caves near river mouths are accessible at low sea stand and flooded later, the record becomes uneven. Preserving a run of marks here, and drowning another there under new estuary mud. Symbol stabilises identity where landscapes drift. At river junctions, beads and pigments signal who belongs and who marries out. At burials, arrangements of ochre and ornament reinforce ties to place and kin. At seasonal shelters, repeated motifs make walls familiar through years when storms prey and plant fruiting differ. Children learn motifs along with routes to water and ways to read wind. They sit near light and watch an elder's hand, then add their own smaller stencils and short incisions to edges of panels and tools. A scale reference sits in the labour that such worlds invest to sew a garment outlined in dot beads is to commit hundreds of hours. To cover a figure in ivory beads measured by the handful is to store labour beyond a single life. To haul ochre from a hill a day's walk away and return with red that will serve hides, fires and walls is to place colour inside the same circuits that carry food and fuel. The secure facts engravings and beads in southern Africa by at least 70,000 years ago, widespread beadwork and ornament in the Levant and North Africa, in the same broad window early musical instruments and carved figures in Europe around 40,000 years ago, hand stencils and animal images in Europe and Ireland, Southeast Asia in the 40s of seasons anchor the scene. The lesser-known details, bead-style networks that track social ties across regions, adhesives where ochre is not only colour but a performance additive. The thousands of hours represented by beads at graves like Sunghyr add texture. The unresolved mysteries, why some regions burst with imagery while others remain spare, how much demography versus environment versus contact drives those patterns, where the earliest roots lie, and which lineages share them, keep the narrative honest. Over it all, the planetary canvas continues to move shorelines and winds, to open and shut doors through which marks pass or are erased. Yet the habit persists because it rides inside tools and bodies pigment that helps glue hold also colours skin. Beads that travel as gifts also carry news. Notches used to count days turn into designs repeated because they ease the hand and please the eye in firelight. In that persistence, symbols after the ashes are less an ornament of survival than one of its instruments binding groups in years when paths lengthen and winters harden and leaving on stone and bone a thin, durable residue of minds that prefer memory to drift. When the great cold loosens and the Holocene steadies, the seasons people begin to lean on plants and animals in ways that slowly reshape both. The shift is not an invention on a morning, but a tightening of ties made during thousands of years of foraging, tending and returning. The planetary frame is the quieter climate of the last 11.5 millennia, reduced variability in temperature and rainfall, compared to the glacial sea level rising toward modern shorelines. monsoon belts settling into ranges that while pulsing give longer windows of predictability. In the Levant, late Epipaleolithic foragers known as Natufians build semi-sedentary hamlets around springs and oaks. Bedrock mortars, sickle blades with glossy sheen from silica-rich grasses and large grinding stones anchor routines that centre cereals long before full domestication. The fact that grounds this section is well established by the early Holocene multiple regions of the world independently domesticate plants and animals, wheat and barley, with goats in the Fertile Crescent, rice and broomcorn, foxtail millet in China, yams and bananas in parts of New Guinea, sorghum in the African Sahel, squash later, maize and beans in Mesoamerica, and potatoes and quinoa in the Andes, each pathway protracted and local then braided into wider ecologies of settlement. In caves of the Zagros, goat bones accumulate with kill profiles that show herding more young males, culled females kept to breed, while dung, spherolites and trampled floors record pens. In the northern Levant and upper Mesopotamia, einkorn and emmer wheat begin to show non-brittle rachises that do not shatter at maturity, a morphological turn that binds seed to stalk and farmer to harvest. A lesser-known detail sits in hearths older than farming itself at Shabaka 1 in northeastern Jordan. Charred crumbs of flatbread, older than 14,000 years, baked from wild cereals and clubrush tubers, mark a cuisine that precedes cultivation proof, that taste and technique run ahead of domestication. Another quiet trace lies in plaster-early pre-pottery Neolithic houses, with lime-plastered floors require large fires to calcine limestone, a fuel demand that signals organised labour and wood procurement woven into daily life. Across the Younger, Dryas, cool snaps, some Natufian sites contract and mobility returns, but when the climate warms again, villages spread round houses give way to rectilinear rooms, storage bins multiply, and fields close enough to walk in a short morning take shape on slopes above springs. In the Yangtze wetlands, people tend wild rice in shallow basins, phytoliths and husk impressions in pottery, later record domestication traits as grains enlarge and seed-shattering declinaus. North on the Less Plateau, millet suits drier fields, its short season aligning with continental summers. Grinding stones carry millet starch, and by the middle Holocene foxtail and broomcorn millets anchor villages where pigs root in courtyards and dogs sleep at doors. In New Guinea's high valleys, drainage ditches and mound gardens at Cook Swamp Track, managed plots of taro and banana on peaty soils, pollen starch and phytoliths. Not massive architecture carry the proof in upland agriculture that grows without cereals, and shows how diverse the first seeds of control can be. In northern Africa and the Sahel, sorghum and pearl millet are coaxed toward forms that hold seed, while in the Sahara's green phases cattle pastoralism and fish-rich lakes support large gatherings whose rock art later survives where water is long gone. In Mesoamerica, early domesticated squash appears before maize reaches its full cob size. Over millennia, Teosinta's handful of hard kernels becomes maize cobs that store easily, and together with beans, they make a field diet that fixes nitrogen and protein. In the Andes, potatoes and quinoa rise on cold margins, and llama and alpaca, herding tie people to high valleys where terrace walls later harness slopes. The unresolved mystery lies not in if, but in why and how fast did climate steadiness encourage population growth that pressed for predictable yields, or did social dynamics, feasts, exchange obligations, alliance building, favour surpluses that fields best supplied? Was domestication generally slow and scattered? Low-level food production stretched over millennia with many local experiments, or were there punctuated intervals where multiple traits clustered quickly under stronger cultivation pressure? Some argue that beer brewed from cereals plays a role in social feasting and thus in cereal demand. Others keep the emphasis on bread and porridge as daily staples. The balance likely differs by place and time, and drowned coasts and thin upland soils hide much of the early record that would settle pace and motive. Day to day, the changes are incremental. Foragers who already clear brush to attract game now burn patches to encourage nut trees and edible greens. They scatter seeds near camps where trampled soil and ash give good germination. They weed around favoured tubers and cut back competitors. They place brush fences to slow grazers from entering plots. They learn the timing of harvest so that cereals can be cut before shattering. In toolkits, sickles hafted with multiple stone inserts appear alongside older points and scrapers, their use wear and gloss testifying to long hours in fields. Grinding stones grow larger and more stationary, planted in the house floors or courtyards. Storage pits deepen and clay-lined bins appear pocked with rodent gnaw, and repaired around rims a small ledger of costs and protection. Animals move closer. Goats tolerate rough brows and steep paths. Sheep follow and offer wool later. Pigs thrive on refuse near houses. Cattle require more water but repay with traction and milk in later systems. Dogs guard stores, pull small loads and clean middens. Dung fuels fires on treeless plains and seals floors. With herds come parasites and pathogens, and thus long cohabitation writes immunity and illness into bodies as well as genes. The planetary observation continues to shape outcomes as the Holocene thermal maximum shifts rain belts northward in some millennia and southward in others. Monsoon strength modulates river discharge and silt loads that build floodplains where fields prefer to lie. CO2 levels rise from glacial lows, raising plant water use efficiency and perhaps easing early cultivation marginally. Later paddies in Asia add methane to the air, a fine signature of fields entering the planet's breath. Land changes with hands. Terraces bind soil on slopes. Small canals and check dams steal a little time from dry seasons. Low rock lines catch seed and moisture on alluvial fans. In wetlands, mounds elevate roots above standing water. In forests, coppice cycles yield straight poles for roofs and fuel for plaster firing. Houses thicken into villages, and then towns with pathways between walls and threshing floors, with mortars that thud in cadence, and with grinding stones where children learn to push and pull. A scale reference rests in the sum of small distances, fields, pastures and water points stitched into loops shorter than a day's walk, grow to territories whose perimeter traced by seasonal tasks can equal a march from Jericho to Çatalhöyük when stretched over a year, intimate in steps continental in aggregate. Through all of this memory remains the key store. Seed is saved from plants that hold kernels longer. Tuber sets are chosen for size and taste. Goat kids are spared or culled by a logic of herd shape rather than a single meal. Exchange networks carry more than mates, and beads now seed varieties move along with stories about rain and pests. Obsidian and fine chert continue to travel, but so do grinding stone blanks and the recipes for plaster and beer. Symbolic life shifts with settlement rather than shrinking. Plastered skulls in Levantine houses keep ancestors near. Figurines appear in villages across Southwest Asia and later far beyond. Pigments still smear onto bodies and walls, and the pattern of meeting at river confluences evolves into scheduled markets and feasts where surplus is displayed and obligations renewed. The secure facts, the multiple independent centres of domestication, the morphological shifts in grains, the herding signatures and kill profiles, the early rice and millet, the New Guinea ditches, the Andean tubers, the African cereals stand clear. The lesser-known details charred pre-agriculture bread at Shubeka, dung spherolites and pen floors in Zagros caves, lime plasters hidden fuel costs, sickle gloss as a calendar of harvest bring the ground close. The unresolved question motives, tempos, and the weight of climate versus social choice remain open and varied by region. Over it all, the planetary frame keeps time, a calmer climate window that with local pulses and setbacks allows people to trade mobility for place and to cultivate landscapes that in turn cultivate them. Fields appear where rivers lay silt. Herds thread between hills where springs rise. Villages cluster on the edges of both. In that narrowing of range and widening of ties, the first seeds of control are less about mastery than about reciprocity. Care returning yield. Yield, returning commitment and commitment, writing houses and paths onto ground that once only held the trace of a passing camp. From ash to memory, the line runs through rivers, fires, and paths that settle into places. As climates steady in the Holocene and coastlines near their present marks, people lean into permanence and begin to record what cannot be trusted to voice alone. Villages thicken into towns along springs and floodplains, then into cities strung like beads on river chains. The Euphrates and Tigris with reed marshes and bitumen seeps the Nile's narrow green ribbon between desert plateaus the Indus, and its shifting arms across a wide alluvial fan, the Yellow and Yangtze edging less and wetland. The planetary frame holds steady enough for fields to return a surplus more years than not. Monsoon belts breathe within ranges that people learn to anticipate, and sea level slows its raise, leaving estuaries and deltas to mature as granaries of fish and silt. The fact that anchors this closing chapter as firm by the 4th millennium BCE writing emerges independently in more than one region proto-cuneiform in southern Mesopotamia by the late 4th millennium and early 3rd in Egyptian hieroglyphs by roughly the same horizon, marking a point at which records outlast lives and prehistory yields to history. The ground still holds older habits shaped by foraging and fire. In the lower Mesopotamian marshes, reed-bound platforms rise on packed mud. In the dry season, reeds twist into ropes and mats, and boats smeared with bitumen ferry people and goods along slow water. A lesser-known detail sits in the small things that make large systems work. Bevel rim bowls, mass-produced in moulds, serve as standardized ration containers in Uruk-level settlements. A ceramic rhythm that pairs with early tablets to track labor and barley. Before tablets, tokens enclosed in clay envelopes, bully, stand for counted goods, and the seal impressions on those envelopes rehearse the logic of sign and authority, even before script bites, triangles into clay. Cylinder seals roll images and names over wet clay to bind doors and jars. Their carved scenes travel with the people who set them, small tools that leave signatures wherever authority must be recognized. To the west, the Nile's flood sets the calendar. Fields drink black water and lay down fresh silt, and early hieroglyphs note names and offerings in context that blend ceremony and account. To the east, signs appear on the Indus stamp seals with animals and short sequences that remain undeciphered. Bricks, fired to consistent ratios often near 1:4, and stone weights calibrated in repeating units across cities separated by hundreds of kilometers. A quiet standardization that keeps exchange legible where writing's sound is lost to us. Farther east, later still, the earliest Chinese inscriptions cut into bone and shell that carried questions to heat and crack a script already mature in form and tied to royal divination. For the present narrative, those marks stand near the time when metal tools and cities pressed into written chronicles. Along these rivers, a longer chain of memory persists in perishable tools and repeated motion. Sickle blades still carry sheen from silica and grasses, grinding stones where shallow basins under hands that have moved in the same arcs since camps were light. Hearths line walls and courtyards where dung and brush burn when wood grows scarce. In the Indus basin, baked brick drains run beneath streets and wells aligned in neat stacks. In the Gulf marshes, reed track and bitumen persist as boat technology that float surplus downriver and fish upriver in their seasons. The unresolved mysteries cluster where the line between record and inference is still thin. What are the sounds and syntax behind the Indus seal signs, and were they used to compose speech or to tag names and goods alone? How much do early scripts anywhere begin as accounting marks, and how quickly do they fold stories, hymns and laws into the same clay and stone? When cities falter, Akkad's dry wind around Fubor. 2,000 years ago, river avulsions in the Indus Plain Nile, floods that fail for several years. How much of the turn rests on climate pulses versus the choices of kings and councils? And beyond script, what counts as writing in Andi and Kipu knotted strings that keep numbers and perhaps categories in a system that registers surplus without ink? The planetary scale observation continues to set tempo beneath these questions. The Holocene high stand leaves some coasts farther inland than modern, but overall stability holds. The 8.2 kilo-year cold pulse and the later 4.2 kilo-year arid interval ripple through monsoon belts and river regimes tightening margins where storage and exchange must carry households across lean years. Rice paddies add methane to air, small but real, and forests felled for fields and plaster kilns lighten hills and fill rivers with silt, binding human habit to the planet's budget. Across these settled landscapes, scale accumulates in small steps. A caravan route from a copper source in the Iranian uplands to a delta warehouse stretches longer than a walk from the head of the Persian Gulf to the Levant. A boatload of grain floated between canals and marsh channels moves at a pace slower than a day's march, but steadier, and with it travel sealing and reckoning the cylinder, seal the tally of jars, the tablet with wedges set down by a scribe. Bitumen from the Euphrates at Hit darkens reed seams. Lapis lazuli drilled in Badakhshan gleams in a city where the nearest mountains are only desert mirage signals that things as well as stories cross distances that would take many seasons on foot. Yet the narrative of memory is not only urban. In uplands and on steppe margins, pastoralists continue the old circuits now with herds shaped by human choice. In wetlands, fish weirs and reed houses repeat arrangements older than any tablet. In forests, patches are burned and left to rest, and old paths still link springs. Where writing does take hold, it folds these older economies into its ledgers and its myths, naming fields, dews and gods in lines that tie grain to temple and king. While in many places beyond the oldest scripts, the turn to history will come later, carried by different materials and motives. The secure facts in this passage to memory stand clear. Proto-cuneiform and hieroglyphs arise in the 4th millennium BCE. Seals, tokens and bullae prefigure and then accompany script. Standardized bricks and weight structure, Indus cities whose signs remain undeciphered. Rivers and monsoons remain master calendars even as writing binds obligations. The lesser-known details, the bevel rim bowl and its ration, the bitumen-smeared reed hull, the long-lived brick ratios, the binary and decimal stone weights give texture to how order is made from surplus. The unresolved mysteries, what the Indus signs say, how quickly signs captured speech, how much climate pulses drove urban turns remain open and sharpened by new cause, new readings and drowned or buried archives yet to surface. And the planetary frame holds the quiet metronome, a stable climate window with pulses that test resilience, sea and silt that draw lines where cities can root and gases that rise a little as fields and herds grow. In this way, the story that began under dimmed skies after a mountain failed now enters a medium that can carry itself beyond voices. The same hands that ground ochre and glued resin now press wedge into clay and cut bird and reed shapes on stone. The same rivers that carried ash in their headwaters now carry tablets and seals. The same fire that cooks tubers and hardened pitch now bakes clay until it rings. Prehistory does not end so much as change its archive from tools and camps alone to tools, camps, and words that endure. The ash has long since washed into soils and lake bottoms. What remains visible above ground are fields, canals, walls and roads, and in storerooms at the centre, shelves of tablets that hold the tallies and the stories that other fires would otherwise erase.